Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for this Spotlight talk. My name is Ursula and I'm the Visitors Services and Heritage Officer here at the Royal Victoria Chapel. Our Spotlight talk today is shining a light on the design of the Royal Victoria Hospital. So the story of the Royal Victoria Hospital began about 170 years ago during the Crimean War, so 1854 to 56, when images like this appeared in the illustrated newspapers and magazines. They brought to public, and perhaps more importantly to royal attention, the appalling and unsanitary conditions experienced by the sick and wounded soldiers. This illustration shows the hospital in Sevastopol in the Crimea, but similar conditions were found in other hospitals, including at Scutari in Turkey, which came to prominence through the work of Florence Nightingale. On the 3rd of March 1855, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert visited convalescent soldiers in the converted army barrack hospitals in Kent. And 2 days later, Queen Victoria wrote to Lord Panmure, the Secretary of State for War, to express her concerns about the accommodation provided for the patients, their stories about their hospital experiences, and the strength of public feeling. She called on him to take action and commission the building of new army hospitals, saying, "This is absolutely necessary, and now is the moment to have them built." Within 2 weeks, Lord Panmure had directed Sir John Fox Burgoyne, Inspector General of Fortifications, to identify a suitable site for a new hospital and established a committee to research and draw up plans for a hospital to provide accommodation of the most approved description for 1,000 patients. Now, that committee consisted of Colonel Terence O'Brien, Assistant Quartermaster General, Henry Mapleton of the Medical Department, then a surgeon with the 15th Hussars, and Robert Laffan, Deputy Inspector General of Fortifications. They in turn called on the services of Mr. E. O'Meny, a surveyor in the Royal Engineers Department, to draw up the plans. Now, the choice of the site at Netley for the hospital will be the subject for another talk, but the land was purchased from Thomas Chamberlain and the foundation stone was laid by Queen Victoria in a ceremony on the 19th of May 1856. So this was about 7 weeks after the end of the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale returned to England in August 1856 and was invited to Balmoral by Queen Victoria to talk about her experiences. And it was at the Queen's request that Lord Panmure also met with Florence Nightingale and showed her the plans for the Royal Victoria Hospital, then several months into its construction. Now, as you might already be aware, Florence was highly critical of many aspects of the hospital's design. So what we're going to do is to look at the design of the building, consider the intentions of the committee of the planners, and look why Florence Nightingale was so concerned. To inform their design, the committee interviewed staff at both military and civilian hospitals in England and abroad, looked at the description and plans of what were considered the best hospitals in France and Holland, and studied the improvements that had been adopted by the London hospitals. And in the report they submitted to Lord Panmure with the plans of the hospital, they outlined the thinking behind some of their key design decisions. So remember, they'd been asked to provide hospital accommodation for 1,000 patients, and they decided that the most convenient way to do this was to distribute the patients between 2 separate hospital buildings, one focused on medical and the other on surgical cases. And you can see those 2 buildings very clearly in the illustration there. Now, each of these buildings would be a complete hospital in itself, which would also make it straightforward to increase the size of the establishment if required in the future. These separate hospitals will be connected by a central building, which you can see in the illustration just in front of the chapel over towards the right-hand side. And this central building would house the initial reception and examination rooms and the offices for the hospital's chiefs of staff and their clerks and the hospital's records. As part of the shared facilities, the central building would also house a bathing room with a pool for therapeutic purposes, as well as hot and cold, fresh and saltwater baths. And on the upper floors would be accommodation for sick or wounded officers who, the committee said in their report, would require the most careful treatment. All parts of the hospital would be connected by the long corridors, a quarter of a mile long, running the full length of the building on the ground, first and second floors, to provide what the report described as direct covered communication between every part of the whole establishment. You can see one of those corridors there, the windows on the right hand side looking towards Southampton Water at the front of the hospital, and on the left hand side the openings and windows into the hospital wards. A slightly different image here showing the ground floor plan of the hospital laid over the modern landscape. You can see the two wings for those separate hospital buildings, the central building there, and the long corridors marked in yellow running that full length of the building. Now, the report that the committee submitted with the plan stated that the authorities were in favour of wards with a limited number of patients, so they had them varying in size from 2 to 16 men. The wards on the ground floor are marked in cream on the plan, so you can see how they all come off that long corridor, and this was the same on the upper floors as well. The designers deliberately aligned all the wards along the front of the hospital to profit as much as possible by the genial influence of the sunshine. They said, the supply of light being a point of great importance to the well-being of the sick, we recommend that the windows should be numerous and that they should be of large size. And that corridor running along the length of the building at the front would moderate any excess of glare. So in this photo of one of the wards in the early 1900s, you can see the glass doors there leading into the hospital corridor and a sense of the reflected light from the windows at the other end of the room. Now, understanding the importance of ventilation, the designers said that in addition to the ordinary means of ventilation, so of that afforded by chimneys, doors and windows, they also planned to provide ventilating tubes to carry off the heated and vitiated or used unclean air and to supply fresh air in the centre of the room. And that's what you can see with that cross-shaped appliance coming from the ceiling with taps to open to allow fresh air to be pumped into the ward. And in this photo of another of the wards, you can also see the fireplace on the back wall there with the vent at the top of the wall almost at ceiling height. The doorway you can see in the right hand corner led to an antechamber, and inside there was a toilet and washroom, a nurse's or orderly's room, and a scullery with a sink for sort of general purpose washing up, what the report described as having all the conveniences and appliances. Now, in the next part of the report, the committee commented that one of the chief points to be considered in planning a large hospital is the manner in which the food should be prepared and supplied to the patient. So if you look on the plan, you can see the T-shaped buildings marked in green that extend into the centre of each of the hospital yards. So this is where the larders, the food preparation rooms, storerooms and kitchens were on the ground floor, with the dining rooms on the first and second floors. This is one of the dining rooms here. All patients who were allowed out of bed were expected to make their way to the dining rooms for meals, and only those on particular diets or those confined to bed had meals brought to them on the wards. There were lifts and staircases between the kitchens and the dining rooms, dumbwaiter types to convey the dinners, and lifts to carry up stores and patients in some cases as well. The yards behind the main buildings were surrounded by lower sort of two-storey buildings with contagion wards, rooms for orderlies, storerooms, coal store, wash houses, mortuary, post-mortem examination rooms and so on. So here we are standing in one of the hospital yards at the northeast corner of the building. You'll need to ignore the World War II Nissen huts, but you'll see that what you're looking at, you've got one of the lift towers on the left-hand side, and then the single-story sort of food stores, preparation rooms, and in the centre of the picture there, the kitchens on the ground floor where that metal staircase comes down, and the dining rooms on the first and second floors. And then, as we can see in this picture, a veranda ran all the way around the yard, which provided covered access to every room. So those are the key parts of the design of the Royal Victoria Hospital as described in the report the committee presented to Lord Panmure, and it all sounds well thought through on paper. So why then did Florence Nightingale have so much to say about it, and what were her concerns? Well, a great and lamentable mistake, singularly unfortunate, and a fatal blunder in hospital building. Well, that gets things off to a good start, doesn't it? And I bet that went down well in the War Department in Pall Mall too. So she started by criticising the choice of site and the local climate, which she declared was unsuitable for a hospital because of the damp air. And in fact, in her mind, riverbanks, estuary shores, valleys, marshy or muddy ground ought to be avoided. She was also concerned about the design of the hospital with those two enclosed yards, which she said impeded the free flow of air around the outside of the building and stagnated the air even before it reaches the wards, something she described as being one of the most serious defects that can be committed in hospital architecture. She was similarly concerned about the height of the main buildings, particularly along the front of the hospital. She said 2 stories are better than 3 and 1 is preferable to 2. And this linked back to her thoughts about the stagnation of air outside the building and the impact that this would have on ventilation and natural light, particularly regarding the lower floors. Now, you'll remember that the committee report talked about the importance of ventilation, light and sunshine, and we've looked at what they did to achieve it. But Florence's views on the design and how it would work in practice are rather different. So, continuing on that idea of the deficiencies in ventilation, Florence said, it's a necessity of hospital construction that every ward must have direct communication with the external air by means of a sufficient number of windows on its opposite sides, and every ward must have its own ventilation distinct and separate from that of every other ward. Now, of course, at Netley, the windows on one side of the ward opened into the outside yard, but the opposite side rather, opened into the hospital corridor. And about that, Florence Nightingale said, to join all the wards and windows on one side by means of a corridor is much more objectionable, because the foul air of all the wards must necessarily pass into the corridor, and from the corridor into each of the wards indiscriminately. And this hospital corridor and how it connected all the wards was one of her biggest criticisms of the design of the Royal Victoria Hospital. So moving on to her idea about the deficiencies of light, the corridor and the alignment of the wards impacting the light coming into those wards. According to Florence, direct sunlight, not only daylight, is considered for speedy recovery, and how in dark wards or wards with a northern aspect, the sick could not by any means be made speedily to recover. Now, of course, the majority of wards at Netley are oriented northeast, southwest, with the south side windows and doors opening into the corridor. The windows on the opposite side face northeast into the yard, so darker, being shaded by the surrounding buildings and giving views of the ash pits, the coal store and the back of the kitchens. Lovely. Florence also criticised the size of the wards. The plan of Netley with its wards for 9 sick is by far the costliest for administration. A ward of 9 people needs 1 day and 1 night orderly and 1/3 of a nurse, so 1 nurse working between 3 wards of this size. However, a ward of 30 sick would only need 2 day orderlies, 1 night orderly, and 1 nurse. In other words, 4 people in total, fewer than 2 people extra, and for more than 3 times the number of patients. So hopefully what you're getting sort of the idea with Florence, it was a case of and another thing, and another thing, and another thing. So really sort of to encapsulate what Florence says, a hospital without sufficient sunlight or natural ventilation, which represents the sanitary neglects of a century back, a perfect rabble of wards and offices thrown together as if by accident, and contrary to every sound principle of hygiene. Or to sum it up, Netley is no fit monument of the Crimean War of the Queen's campaign, or of Lord Palmerston himself, the Prime Minister, who deserves more. Florence Nightingale even wrote to Lord Palmerston, Prime Minister, and he wrote to Lord Panmure saying, "At Netley, all consideration of what would best tend to the comfort and recovery of the patients has been sacrificed to the vanity of the architect, whose sole object has been to make a building which should cut a dash when looked at from Southampton Water." And in fact, his next words were, "Pray stop all work," while they investigated and considered Florence Nightingale's criticisms and decided what action to take. So that's what they did. They looked again at the report and the plans. They considered the designer's intentions and how they might work in practice, and looked at the points made by Florence Nightingale and their supporting evidence. Now, the conclusion of the investigating commission was that some amendments and improvements should be made to the design and the organisation of some of the wards and staff quarters. But what do you think? You've heard the designer's intentions and you've heard Florence Nightingale's criticisms. Who do you think was right? I'll leave that up to you to discuss and decide. If you want to find out more, the report on the plans of the hospital can be downloaded from the Wellcome Collection archive, whilst Florence Nightingale's criticisms can be found in her book, Notes on Hospitals, which is also available online. In the meantime, keep an eye out for more of our Spotlight talks, and do let us know if there's a particular theme you'd like us to cover. Thank you for watching.